Welcome to History Unwound, Episode 4 Hannibal Barca.
In the autumn of 218 before the Common Era, somewhere on a goat track in the high Alps, a column stops moving. The trail has narrowed to a ledge of ice. Behind the lead elephant stretches a line of men 3 days long, soldiers from a dozen nations, mercenaries from Numidia and Iberia and Gaul, baggage mules, the surviving war elephants of an army that began its march in Spain. Ahead of them is a slope no animal will willingly cross. The handlers coax the lead elephant forward. It refuses. Snow has begun to fall again, not the wet snow of the lower passes but the dry, hard snow of altitude, and the men in the column are wrapped in whatever they could carry, cloaks doubled, hands pressed under armpits. Some of them are dying where they stand. At the head of the column rides a man of 29. He is not tall. By the accounts that survive, he is dark, lean, watchful, with the kind of stillness that frightens men who have seen real soldiers. His name is Hannibal Barca. He is a Carthaginian, which is to say he comes from a city on the North African coast that Rome already considers an old enemy. He has been planning this march since he was a boy, and the question that haunts the rest of his life, and the rest of this episode, is the question that Rome itself could not answer in time. Why was this man marching from this direction at this time? Rome had expected, if war came, to fight Carthage in the western Mediterranean. Rome had expected naval engagements off Sicily, perhaps a landing in Africa. Rome had not expected an army to climb out of the mountains behind it, in winter, dragging elephants. To understand how Hannibal Barca came to be standing on that ledge, with that army, looking down on the Italian plain that no foreign general had reached in living memory, you have to go back further than his own life. You have to go back to the war his father lost. The First Punic War began in 264 before the Common Era, and lasted 23 years. It was fought, mostly, over the island of Sicily. Carthage at that time was the older power, a trading empire, built on the harbors of North Africa, with colonies along the coast of Spain, with a navy that ruled the Western Sea. Rome was a rising republic, landbound, and at the start of the war, Rome did not have a navy worth the name. By the end of the war, Rome had built one. In one of the more remarkable industrial efforts of the ancient world, the Roman Senate authorized the construction of fleet after fleet, losing them in storms, losing them in battle, building them again. Carthage, slower to replace its losses, slowly bled. In 241 before the Common Era, Carthage signed a peace treaty. Sicily passed to Rome. An indemnity was imposed. 3 years later, when Carthage was occupied with a mercenary revolt, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica as well, and demanded a further indemnity for the privilege. In the Carthaginian Senate this was understood for what it was: a humiliation. One Carthaginian general took it personally. His name was Hannibal Barca. He had commanded Carthage's last forces in Sicily, and he had not, technically, been defeated in the field. He had been ordered home, because the navy supporting him was gone. Hannibal belonged to a faction in Carthage that believed the war was not over. He believed it had merely paused. In the years after the peace, Hannibal took his family and a Carthaginian army westward, to the Iberian Peninsula, to what is now Spain. Spain had silver. Spain had manpower, fierce tribal warriors who could be hired or conscripted. Spain was a base from which a future Carthage could be rebuilt. In 237 before the Common Era, before Hannibal sailed for Spain, he went to a temple in Carthage to offer sacrifice. He took with him his eldest son, a boy of 9. What happened next is one of the most consequential father and son moments in ancient military history, and we have it from Hannibal himself, by way of the Greek historian Polybius, who heard it from men who heard it from Hannibal in his old age. Hannibal finished the sacrifice. He sent the other priests and witnesses out of the inner chamber. He took his son by the hand and led him to the altar. He asked the boy whether he wanted to come with him to Spain. The boy said yes. Hannibal then placed the child's hand on the body of the sacrificial victim, still warm, and made him swear an oath. Not the oath, in some later tellings, that the boy would destroy Rome. The oath was quieter than that, and worse. The boy swore, with his hand on the altar, that he would never be a friend to Rome. He was 9. His name was Hannibal. He kept the oath for 54 years. Hannibal took him to Spain. For the next decade, Hannibal grew up in a Carthaginian military camp on the edge of the empire, surrounded by the silver mines, the Iberian recruits, the African veterans of his father's old wars. He learned Greek, he learned to ride, he learned, by all accounts, to sleep on the ground when he had to, and to eat what the soldiers ate. In 228 before the Common Era, his father drowned in a river during a campaign against an Iberian tribe. Command of the Carthaginian forces in Spain passed to Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair. When Hasdrubal was assassinated, 8 years later, the army in Spain elected Hannibal as their commander by acclamation. He was 26. What he did next was deliberate. On the eastern coast of Spain stood a city called Saguntum. Saguntum was a Greek-speaking trading town that had, in recent years, made itself an ally of Rome. It sat south of the Ebro River, inside what Carthage considered its sphere of influence. It was, in modern terms, a tripwire. Hannibal besieged it. The siege lasted 8 months. Saguntum fell. Rome sent ambassadors to Carthage and demanded that Hannibal be handed over. The Carthaginian Senate refused. Rome declared war. This is the moment the Second Punic War begins. But Hannibal had begun it years earlier, in his own mind, as a problem of geography. The Roman fleet controlled the sea. If Carthage tried to land an army in Italy by ship, the army would never arrive. If Carthage waited to be attacked, the war would be fought again in Spain and Africa, as the first one had been, and the result would likely be the same. So, Hannibal proposed something that, on its face, was not possible. He proposed to walk to Italy. In the spring of 218, before the Common Era, he left New Carthage, on the southern coast of Spain, with an army that contemporary sources put at roughly 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry. He had 37 war elephants. He had a war chest of silver. He had no resupply. No ships would meet him. No reinforcements would land at any port he passed. Once the column moved north of the Ebro, it was on its own. He crossed the Ebro. He fought through the tribes of the eastern Pyrenees, leaving garrisons behind to hold the route open, dismissing soldiers who did not want to go further. By the time he reached the Rhône River in southern Gaul, his army was already smaller, perhaps 50,000 men, and he had not yet seen a Roman. At the Rhône, the Gallic tribes on the far bank gathered to oppose the crossing. Hannibal sent a detachment upstream by night to cross at a quieter point and circle behind them. When the detachment lit signal fires the next morning, Hannibal forced the main crossing, and the Gauls, attacked from 2 sides, broke. The elephants were the harder problem. Elephants, by long experience, do not like deep water. His engineers built rafts, anchored them to the bank, covered them with earth so that they looked like extensions of the shore, and walked the elephants on. When the rafts were cut loose, the elephants panicked. Some swam, some were lost. Most reached the far bank. By the time word of the crossing reached the Roman consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had been sent with an army to intercept Hannibal in Gaul, Hannibal was already gone. He had turned northeast, toward the Alps. What happens in the Alps in the autumn of 218, before the Common Era, is one of the great endurance feats of the ancient world, and the sources do not entirely agree on the route. Polybius gives one set of passes, Livy gives another. Modern historians have argued for a century over which coal Hannibal crossed. The details that survive are not the geography, but the texture of the suffering. The first ambush came from the Allobroges, a Gallic people who held the lower passes. They let the column enter the narrows, and then rolled stones from above. Men and pack animals went over the edge in the dark. The column kept moving, because there was no way back. Higher up, the snow began. By this stage in the year, the upper passes were already deep, and the snow above the tree line had a dry, granular quality that did not pack underfoot. Men slipped. Animals slipped. On one infamous stretch of trail, a recent landslide had cut the path entirely, leaving a gap of bare rock that the elephants would not cross. Polybius records that Hannibal's engineers built fires on the rock face, heated it, and then poured vinegar over the cracks to split the stone, working with picks for a day and a night until they had cut a path wide enough for the animals to pass. Whether this worked exactly as described, or whether vinegar is doing some literary labor in the story, the column did get through. What came down out of the Alps onto the Italian plain in late autumn was not the army that had left Spain. By the most careful estimates, Hannibal had perhaps 20,000 infantry left, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of elephants. He had lost more than half his army to the mountains and to the tribes, and not yet fought a Roman battle. Rome did not know he was there. When the news reached the Senate, The response was disbelief, then panic, then mobilization. The first Roman general to find him was the same Publius Scipio who had missed him at the Rhône, now back in northern Italy with a smaller force. At a tributary of the Po called the Trebia, in late December of 218 before the Common Era, the Romans crossed the icy river to attack the Carthaginian camp at dawn. Hannibal had wanted them to. He had fed his men a hot meal. He had oiled their skin against the cold. He had hidden 2,000 soldiers in a stream bed on the Roman flank. When the Romans, wet and shivering, engaged his line, the hidden force struck their rear. The first major battle of the Second Punic War ended in the destruction of a Roman army before most of Italy had even understood that there was a war. In the spring, he moved south. At Lake Trasimene, in central Italy, in June of 217 before the Common Era, Hannibal did something that thereafter became a permanent entry in the textbook of military deception. He marched his army past a defile on the lake's northern shore. He left a small visible rearguard. In the heavily wooded hills above the road, he hid the rest of his army. At dawn the next morning, in heavy fog rising off the lake, the Roman consul Gaius Flaminius led his legions into the defile to chase what he believed was the rear of a retreating column. When the fog burned off, the hills were full of Carthaginians. The Romans had no time to form a line. They were attacked on the road, on the lake shore, in the water itself. An entire Roman army, 15,000 men or more, was killed in a few hours. Flaminius was killed. The road to Rhône was, in theory, open. Hannibal did not take it. He moved south instead, into the rich country of Apulia, looking for the one thing he did not have, which was Italian allies. Rome's strength had never been in any single legion. It had been in the network of Italian cities tied to her by treaty, by colony, by intermarriage. Hannibal believed, correctly, that if enough of those cities defected, Rome would have no more soldiers to send. He needed a victory so total that the question of whether Rome could be defeated would be answered. He got it the next summer. On a hot August day in 216 before the Common Era, on a plain near a small Apulian village called Cannae, the largest Roman army ever assembled to that date, perhaps 80,000 men under 2 consuls, met Hannibal's force of about 50,000. What followed is the most studied tactical engagement in the history of warfare. Hannibal arranged his line in a shallow crescent, bowed outward toward the Romans, with his weakest infantry in the center and his most experienced African veterans at the wings. When the Roman center pressed forward, as he intended, the crescent slowly bent the other way, retreating in good order, drawing the Roman mass deeper. The African wings held. The Carthaginian cavalry, having defeated the Roman cavalry on both flanks, swung around behind the Roman rear. The Roman army, which had been pushing forward all afternoon, suddenly found itself surrounded on every side, packed so tightly that men in the interior could not raise their arms to fight. The killing went on for hours. The lowest credible figure for the Roman dead is 45,000. The highest is closer to 70,000. Either way, in a single afternoon, on a single field, a Roman army the size of a small nation simply ceased to exist. Among the dead were one of the consuls, 80 senators, and most of the Roman officer class of that generation. What Hannibal accomplished at Cannae was a double envelopment, and for 2,000 years afterward, generals from every tradition would try to do it again. Most would fail. Hannibal had won the most complete tactical victory in ancient history, and then, he did not march on Rome. This is the decision that has haunted historians for 2,000 years. The night after Cannae, in the Carthaginian camp, his cavalry commander Hannibal is supposed to have urged him to march at once on the city, promising that within 5 days Hannibal would dine on the Capitolian hill. Hannibal said he needed to think about it. Hannibal answered with one of the most quoted lines in military history. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You do not know how to use one." Whether Hannibal really said this, or whether Livy gave it to him 3 centuries later for dramatic effect, the question itself was real, and remains real. Why did he not take Rome? The honest answer is that we do not entirely know. What can be said is what he did not have. He did not have a siege train. Rome's walls, in 216 before the Common Era, were already formidable, and reducing a city of that size by assault would have required equipment Hannibal had not brought across the Alps, and could not build quickly in hostile country. He did not have a clear logistical line to feed an army camped outside Rhône through a long siege. He did not, crucially, have the defections he had counted on. After Cannae, several southern Italian cities did go over to him, including Capua, the second city of Italy. The core of Roman Italy did not. The Latin colonies, the towns most tightly bound to Rome by old treaty, held. Rome refused to negotiate. In the days after Cannae, when most ancient powers would have sued for peace, the Roman Senate forbade public mourning, conscripted slaves into the legions, and asked Hannibal for nothing. He may also have believed, with some reason, that he could not actually take the city, and that what he could do was strangle it slowly by detaching its allies. So he turned south to Capua, and waited for an empire to come apart. It did not come apart. What followed was 15 years of war on Italian soil, and it is in this long second act that the shape of Hannibal's life becomes most visible. He never lost a major battle in Italy. In skirmish after skirmish, in pitched engagement after pitched engagement, he held his ground or moved at will. But he was alone. Carthage, divided politically, sent him only a fraction of the reinforcements he needed. His brothers fought hard campaigns in Spain and lost them, slowly, to the Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio. The son of the consul Hannibal had outflanked the Rome. Rome adopted, against him, the strategy of Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius understood that no Roman general of his generation could meet Hannibal in open battle and win. So Fabius did not give him battle. He shadowed the Carthaginian army. He cut off foraging parties. He attacked stragglers. He refused, year after year, to commit a legion to a pitched fight. In Rome, this strategy was unpopular, and Fabius was mocked for it, given the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. The mockery faded after Cannae. After Cannae, the strategy of avoidance became Roman doctrine, and Hannibal, with no fortified base and no resupply, slowly began to wear away from attrition rather than defeat. In 207 before the Common Era, his brother Hasdrubal marched from Spain with a relief army, repeating, in his own way, the great crossing of the Alps. He got through. He came down into northern Italy with elephants of his own, and forces enough to perhaps tip the balance. 2 Roman armies caught him at the river Metarus before he could link up with his brother in the south. Hasdrubal was killed in the battle. His head was cut off, and carried on a Roman cavalryman's saddle, the length of Italy, and thrown over the palisade into Hannibal's camp. Polybius records that when Hannibal saw it, he said that he saw in it the fate of Carthage. He had been on Italian soil for 11 years. He held on for 4 more. By 203 before the Common Era, Scipio, who had taken Spain from the Carthaginians, had landed an army in North Africa and was approaching Carthage itself. The Carthaginian Senate recalled Hannibal home. He had not seen the city of his birth in 36 years. He left Italy in good order, by sea, and crossed without losing a ship, and landed near Carthage to find a war he no longer recognized. In the autumn of 202 before the Common Era, on a plain called Zama, Hannibal and Scipio met for the only time. Both were among the finest commanders of their century. Both knew, in detail, what the other could do. By tradition, on the morning of the battle, the 2 men met between the lines for a private conversation, and what they said is not preserved. What is preserved is the result. Scipio's cavalry, reinforced by Numidian allies who had once fought for Carthage, defeated Hannibal's cavalry early. Hannibal's elephants were channeled harmlessly through gaps Scipio had deliberately left in his line. When the cavalry returned and struck the Carthaginian rear, the same envelopment Hannibal had used at Cannae was used against him. The Second Punic War ended on that field. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were severe. An indemnity larger than the city had ever paid before, the surrender of Spain, the reduction of the Carthaginian fleet to 10 ships. No war, anywhere, without Roman permission. Hannibal, surprisingly, did not flee. He went into politics. For 7 years he was the chief magistrate of Carthage, and he proved as effective in administration as he had been in the field. He reformed the city's finances. He uncovered corruption among the old aristocratic families. He paid down the indemnity ahead of schedule. In the process, he made enemies among the very oligarchs whose wealth he had exposed, and those enemies wrote letters to Rome. In 195 before the Common Era, Roman commissioners arrived in Carthage demanding that Hannibal be turned over. He left the city by night. He sailed east. What followed was 20 years of exile. He went first to the court of the Seleucid king Antiochus III, who was preparing his own war against Rome. Antiochus consulted Hannibal, accepted some of his advice, ignored the rest, and lost. When the peace came, one of Rome's terms was the surrender of Hannibal. He left again. He went to the Armenian court. He went, eventually, to the small kingdom of Bithynia on the Black Sea coast, where an aging king named Prusias still valued the strategic mind of an old Carthaginian general. Rome kept hunting him. In 183 before the Common Era, Roman envoys arrived in Bithynia and demanded his extradition. Prusias did not refuse. By the accounts that have come down to us, Hannibal had prepared for this. He had built his house with 7 exits. He had a vial of poison kept ready. On the day the Roman soldiers came for him, all 7 exits were watched. He was 64 years old. He drank the poison. The line attributed to him, before he died, was this: "Let us release the Romans from their long-standing concern, since they think it too long a wait for the death of an old man." He had kept the oath. Carthage outlived him by 37 years. In 146 before the Common Era, in what is now called the Third Punic War, a Roman army under another Scipio, the grandson by adoption of the man who had defeated Hannibal at Zama, breached the walls of Carthage. The fighting in the streets lasted 6 days. What survived of the population was sold into slavery. The city itself was systematically destroyed, building by building, and the Roman Senate, by formal decree, forbade resettlement on the site. The story that the ground was sown with salt is almost certainly later embellishment, but the intent was real. Carthage, as a city, was meant to be erased. What was not erased was the lesson of Cannae. In every staff college in the modern world, the diagram of that summer afternoon in 216 before the Common Era is still drawn on a board. The double envelopment, the bowed center, the cavalry sweep around the rear, has been the dream of generals ever since. The German chief of staff Alfred von Schlieffen, in the late 19th century, designed an entire war plan around the idea of repeating Cannae against France. George Patton studied it. John Pershing studied it. Norman Schwarzkopf, in the desert in 1991, spoke of it explicitly. Most of these attempts failed in their full ambition. None of them surpassed the original. What does it mean that the most studied military mind of the ancient world was a man kept marching by a single childhood oath? It means, in part, that history is small. The war that consumed 2 empires, that emptied Italian fields for a generation, that ended with a city erased from the coast of Africa, began at an altar in 237 before the Common Era, with a man's hand on his son's hand, and a sentence the boy was made to repeat. It means that the line between private grief and public catastrophe is thinner than we are usually willing to admit. Hannibal Barca lost a war and gave his loss to a child. The child, in turn, gave the loss to the world. It also means, perhaps, that genius alone is not enough. Hannibal won every battle that mattered, except the last one. He understood his enemy better than his enemy understood him. He marched in army across the Alps in winter. He destroyed, in the open field, the largest army Rome had ever put under arms. And he still lost. He lost because Rome would not stop. He lost because the cities he expected to defect did not. He lost because the reinforcements he needed were sent late, or not at all, or sent and intercepted. He lost because, in the long calculus of attrition, the side that can replace what it loses outlasts the side that cannot, and Carthage, in the end, could not. On a wall outside the modern city of Tunis, near the bay where the old Punic harbor used to be, there is a low stretch of stone that archaeologists believe was part of the seawall of Carthage. You can stand at it now. It is unremarkable. Most visitors walk past it. Somewhere beneath those stones, beneath the layer of Roman colony built on top of the destruction, beneath the centuries since, lies the city the boy at the altar believed he was protecting. He did not protect it, but he is the reason we remember it. And that, in the end, is the strange afterlife of Hannibal Barca. He did not destroy Rome. He did not save Carthage. He did not, in any conventional sense, accomplish what he set out to do. What he did was make the war so terrible, and the victories so complete, and the loss so personal, that 2,000 years later we still teach his name in the scores of his enemies' descendants. The boy who took the oath at the altar in 237 before the Common Era has never quite stopped marching. He marches in every textbook diagram of an envelopment. He marches in every staff officer's bibliography. He marches in the long memory of a war that ended an empire and began another. So, don't let history be forgotten.
Thanks for watching today. If you liked this podcast, please remember to like and subscribe, and don't let history be forgotten.